The year was approximately 2,000 years before the birth of Christ. A man named Abram had just done something that should not have been possible. With 318 trained servants, he had pursued and defeated a coalition of 4 kings who had raided the region, plundered the city of Sodom, and taken his nephew Lot captive. He brought back every person, every possession, and every piece of spoil. On his return, 2 men came out to meet him. The first was the king of Sodom, who made him an offer. "Keep all the goods, just give me back the people." The second was a man named Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of God Most High. He brought bread and wine and blessed Abram in the name of the God who had delivered his enemies into his hand. Abram's response to these 2 men said everything about who he was. To the king of Sodom, who offered him wealth by right of conquest, he refused. He would not take so much as a sandal strap. He would not allow a pagan king to say he had made Abram rich. To Melchizedek, the priest of God Most High, he gave a tenth of everything. Not because a law required it, there was no law yet. He gave it because he understood something about the nature of the victory that most people miss entirely. He already knew the tithe was not about the money. The Hebrew word behind the tithe is maser. It means tenth. And in the original context, a tithe was not a financial transaction. It was a declaration. When Abram gave a tenth to Melchizedek, he was declaring publicly and formally that the victory he had just won did not belong to him. The spoils did not originate with his strength or his strategy. They came from the God whom Melchizedek served, and in whose name Abram had acted. The tithe was an act of acknowledgement. It was worship in the form of a material transfer. This is the foundation of the entire biblical principle, and it is the piece of the conversation about tithing that most modern teaching skips past in its rush to get to the promise. Malachi chapter 3 verse 10 is the verse you have heard preached more often than almost any other verse on money. "Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be room enough to store it." The promise in that verse is real. God was not speaking metaphorically. He was issuing a direct invitation to test him. He said so plainly. But the verse most people do not read alongside it is the one immediately preceding it. Verse 8. God asks the people of Israel, "Will a mere mortal rob God? Yet you rob me." And they ask, "How are we robbing you?" He answers, "In tithes and offerings." The context of Malachi's challenge is not a church that was not giving 10%. It was a community whose giving had become disconnected from its original meaning. They were going through the motions of an offering while withholding the heart behind it. God called that robbery, not shortfall, robbery. That distinction matters enormously for how you assess your own giving, because the tithing error this video is about is not primarily a mathematical one. Most people who attend church regularly know the 10% figure. They have heard it from the pulpit, they have read it in the bulletin, they have calculated it in their head. The error is not in the number, it is in what the number has been reduced to. Proverbs chapter 3 verses 9 and 10 say, "Honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your produce. Then your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats will be bursting with wine." The operative word in that passage is first fruits, not a tenth from what remains after the bills are paid, not a tithe calculated on net rather than gross. The first and the best of what comes in, given back before anything else is allocated. Abraham did not tithe from his leftovers. He tithed from the spoils of victory at the moment of greatest abundance before he had spent a single denarius of it. He gave from the top. That is the model Proverbs is describing. Honor the Lord first with the best of what you have received and trust him to fill what remains. So here is where this lands in your actual life, not in the abstract, in the specific way you handle your income and the days after it arrives. Most people who tithe have a system. Some give what they can at the end of the month after expenses have settled. Some give when they feel moved. Some give from their net income and reason that the tax was already taken before they saw it. Some give inconsistently, more in seasons of abundance, less when things feel tight. None of these patterns are inherently wicked, but not all of them reflect what the Bible actually describes when it talks about honoring God with your wealth. Ask yourself this honestly. Is your tithe the first transaction you make with your income, or is it the last adjustment you make after everything else has been allocated? Here is the part of the tithing conversation that most sermons do not reach, because it requires naming something uncomfortable. The reason the blessing in Malachi 3 verse 10 is not landing in the lives of many faithful church-going people is not because they are not giving. It is because they have separated the act of giving from the posture of giving. And what God is looking at is not just the amount, it is what the amount represents. Malachi's original audience was not a congregation of atheists. They were the people of Israel. They had the law. They knew about tithes. They were giving something. But their giving had become detached from the acknowledgement that Abram expressed when he handed a tenth to Melchizedek, the recognition that everything they had came from God, the declaration that God's claim on their income was first, not last, the act of trust that said, I will give the first fruits before I know if enough remains, because I believe the God who gave it can sustain what follows. When a tithe is given at the end of the month from whatever is left, it is not wrong, but it is also not what Proverbs 3 verse 9 is describing. Honoring God with what is left after you have honored everything else is not the same act as honoring Him first. The sequence is the statement, and the sequence is what most modern tithing has quietly reversed without anyone naming it. There is also a second error that is less discussed but equally significant. The full verse in Malachi does not say bring a tithe, it says bring the whole tithe. The word whole matters. God was not correcting a people who were giving nothing. He was correcting a people who were giving partially, keeping back a portion, bringing most of it but not all of it, and trusting that close enough would satisfy the covenant. It did not. He named it robbery. The whole tithe is not a suggestion about generosity. It is the stated condition of the promise, and you cannot claim the full promise on a partial offering. Here is what faithful tithing looks like in practical terms this week. First, settle the sequence. When your income arrives, the tithe moves before the mortgage, before the groceries, before the phone bill, and before the savings transfer. Not because God needs your money before your landlord does, but because the sequence is the declaration. It is the material act of saying this came from you first, and I am acknowledging that before I allocate anything else. If you cannot do this immediately because of existing commitments, decide today that the next income you receive will be handled in this order. One pay cycle of obedience in the right sequence is a beginning. Second, examine the whole. If you're calculating your tithe on your net income after taxes, consider whether that calculation reflects the principle of first fruits. The tithe was always calculated on increase, not on what remained after deductions. That does not mean there is only one permissible way to calculate it, but it does mean it is worth examining whether the number you have settled on is the number of genuine first fruits or the number of comfortable compromise. Third, make it consistent. God did not say, bring a tithe in the months when it feels manageable. Malachi 3 verse 10's challenge to test him is only testable when the giving is regular enough to observe the pattern of what follows. An inconsistent tithe produces inconsistent data. If you want to test whether God keeps the promise, you have to maintain the practice long enough to see what happens. Abram stood at the crossroads of two offers on the day he returned from his greatest victory. One offer would have made him wealthy by the world's calculation. He refused it. One act of giving would have seemed to diminish what he held in his hands. He gave it freely, from the top, before he had allocated a single piece of it to himself. Melchizedek blessed him, and the God in whose name that blessing was given is the same God who extended the same invitation through Malachi centuries later. Test me, bring the whole, bring it first, and see if I do not open what you cannot open for yourself.
The blessing has not been withheld. The sequence has been reversed. The storehouse has been receiving what remained rather than what came first. And a partial offering, given last, from a heart that has already decided how much it needs, is not the tithe Malachi was describing. The correction is simple. It is not comfortable, but it is the one the promise is actually attached to.